All right, so Sharon, I usually start out my first question is almost always kind of what was going on in your life to for you to start connecting the dots when it came to ADHD. But I want to start differently with you because you have such an interesting, unique background in terms of this journey of neurodivergency. So you started, let me get this all straight. You started the Autism Journeys radio show and podcast 5 years ago or 6 years ago?
5 years.
5 years ago as a parent who had children who were diagnosed with autism and other, coexisting learning you use additional needs. I was going to say, you use a beautiful phrase. So you kind of started this as a parent who was looking to get more information and to help her children. And over the course of this time, you've really kind of learned a lot about yourself. So I will stop talking and ask you kind of how did this journey start for you with the radio show? What made you want to start it? And then I think, we can get into your own diagnoses for yourself.
Perfect. So I suppose, as you rightly said, I'm a mom to multiply identified autistic kiddos who have other co-occurring conditions, including ADHD. I suppose ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, sensory processing disorder, learning difficulties, and so on. And I suppose when I initially, when I was first, we'd say identified as an autism parent specifically, there was very, very few supports available in our catchment area here in Southern Ireland. And I suppose I felt that in order to best meet my children's needs, I needed to upskill and educate myself and figure things out and best position myself to support them in whatever way they needed to be supported. I suppose I went back to college as a person in my early to mid 30s and spent a number of years studying autism and so on and so forth. And I suppose during that time, I found myself meeting more and more parents of children, neurodivergent kiddos who were not receiving any support either. And I suppose I just felt that I had some level of knowledge and some level of where to begin, I suppose, in information that might need to be shared. And so I decided that, wouldn't it be wonderful to maybe help support other families and other parents and so on in supporting their little people as well. So I suppose that's where it was born from. Quite literally. Now, I will credit a friend of mine who was a wonderful drama teacher. She lived in the States for quite a number of years and so on. And she persuaded me initially to kind of step into it because I was very apprehensive that I might not be the best person and I don't have a great radio voice and I don't have this and I don't have that. That kind of negative kind of conversation that goes on. But actually, it's probably one of the best things I've done, and it's definitely one of the things that I'm most proud of.
Isn't it incredible to sort of, I've loved thinking about how I learn best is through this medium, right? Of asking questions and having these conversations. And it's really sort of helped shape kind of my relationship with learning, because I always sort of thought I wasn't much of a student. I, wasn't very smart. And so I feel like, this whole journey for me of having these interviews and taking reaching out to people and learning through lived experiences has been really eye-opening into kind of the different ways in which we educate ourselves and become, and help ourselves. And then, as you said, in turn, help our children and help our family. And
yeah, absolutely.
Having a podcast where I interview women who were diagnosed in adulthood, I've beat so many women who came through their own diagnosis through their children. But I feel like yours wasn't quite as simple, because honestly, my question is like, 5 years of interviewing, what was going on in the back of your mind thinking, is this me? I check some of these boxes, but at the same time, like the conversation around autism, when it's always about, when it's mostly about, what am I trying to even ask? Let me sort out my thoughts right here. What am I trying to ask? I think I'm curious for you, kind of what was going on behind the scenes over the course of these years, talking about autism in as a parent, where you sort of started to shift your spotlight, I guess, so to speak, on yourself and think like, I am also what autism looks like, because we have this idea of what autism looks like. And I feel like the conversation has shifted so much over the past few years in terms of like, what does autism look like in children? What does it look like in girls? What does it look like in adult women? So what was going on for you behind the scenes?
So I suppose for me, I know when I first started studying, as I say, there was lots of talk around autism and those kind of core areas of identification that are kind of included in that diagnostic process. And for me, I found that I was kind of looking and I was like, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. And I can remember a lecturer specifically saying to me, in the same way that a medical student will immediately feel like absolutely they've got every medical condition that they're looking at, that will kind of dissipate and that it will settle, and that everybody most likely is feeling like this, but that things will settle within the first couple of months or whatever. And that was back in, jeepers, was that 2010, 2011 time. And I was kind of going, okay, so I was waiting for this to dampen down, these feelings to dampen down, and they didn't. And I suppose the more I sat with it, the more I kind of started analysing different areas and different kind of conversations that I've had and different kind of interactions that I've had and so on. And I suppose I was looking, and I suppose to outline, for me, I have 6 kiddos, and I only have 1 daughter. So 5 of my children are little boys. And I suppose I was looking at myself through the lens of what my understanding from a little male perspective might be. And I was going, I don't know, should I or shouldn't I, and so on. Should I find out about this? And it was kind of bubbling up and going back down and so on. And I suppose back in maybe about 2016, I sat with it for a little while and I was kind of thinking, actually, I think this makes a huge amount of sense for me. But it still took me another while to even consider going about an autism diagnosis. And I suppose during that time, my daughter was identified as well and so on. So there was all this kind of, I suppose I was trying to model for my kiddos how to be your authentic self, but I wasn't living that truth, if that makes sense. So I suppose back in, believe it or not, it took me 4 more years to go about an autism diagnosis. And just at the beginning of the pandemic, back in 2020, I decided that I had had enough of being unkind to myself, giving out to myself all of the time, telling myself that I wasn't good enough, or that I was always making mistakes, or, those kind of real self-deprecating kind of comments. And so I went about an autism assessment, and at that time the clinician did tell me that yes, I do believe that you meet the criteria for autism. However, I don't know, do you need the piece of paper? Because the reality is, as if it was for me, I'd hate anybody to know that I was autistic. And I remember feeling, oh, sweet mother of God, this is just awful. It had the complete opposite effect, if that makes sense. It didn't allow for me to become kinder to myself. And I found myself not feeling ashamed, but very, very slow to share my autism diagnosis with anybody at all, so much so that there was maybe 3 or 4 people who in my very close circle knew that I was autistic, so much so that I actually decided back in January of this year to go about another assessment. And at that time, I met with a gorgeous woman called Barb Cook. She's one of the authors of Spectrum Women Walking to the Beat of Your Autism. And she's the opposite side of the world. She's in New Zealand. And I had a bit of a chat with her, and she immediately said to me, she said, Sharon, I think that you remind me so much of myself. And not only do you remind me of myself in the context of autism, you also remind me of myself in the context of ADHD. I am an ADHDer as well. And I suppose I kind of went, jeepers, okay. And I suppose that's where I suppose with regards to the autism piece, I think that conversation I had with Barb in January, where she confirmed for me my neurodivergent identity, but confirmed it in a very kind way, that it was then that I absolutely stepped into who I am. And it definitely had the wonderful effect of empowering me to become kinder to myself and less critical of myself, and just I suppose I definitely feel more empowered to be my authentic self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I often, I feel like a diagnosis, regardless of whether it's ADHD or autism, I think any sort of confirmation of neurodivergency, perhaps is what I'm trying to say. It provides you with a language. It provides you with a validation to then start to assert yourself, to ask for what you need, to understand why you are doing what you're doing, to have that kinder conversation with yourself, right? I talk about this a lot on the podcast about how, the diagnosis is such a revelation to us in terms of in our narrative, in terms of our self-talk, in terms of just how we look at ourselves. And yet it can be so disheartening when we talk about it with other people who really don't understand what the diagnosis means, and they start thinking, "Oh, I'm sorry about your disorder," and all of these ways in which it can be really difficult to talk about with outside of your inner circle, and how sometimes my advice is just not to talk about it. And I don't know if that's the best advice, honestly, because I feel like, there's those of us who are living out loud and have, doing as much awareness raising as possible for changing the view around neurodivergency. But at the same time, like when it comes to yourself and your own life, like sometimes the diagnosis is enough for you and your journey, and it gives you the validation, but you don't necessarily have to always be talking about it. But then I'm like, well, are we doing a disservice to neurodivergency by not talking openly about it always, even in those uncomfortable moments? Yeah. Because, then we're just perpetuating stereotypes and we're perpetuating the stigma. And I never know, but it is really difficult when you come up upon people, like you said, with your initial diagnosis, which was like, I wouldn't talk, like, do you really want this? Is this really something you want to talk about or need or be open about? I think that with regards to whether or not somebody is loud and proud or whether or not somebody is very quietly confident, it should be and has to be centred on the individual's choice. There should be no pressure for anybody to out themselves or to be outed, and equally there should be no pressure on anybody to have to stay quiet if they choose not to. I kind of think that I suppose so. For me, my young lady. My young lady was identified as an ADHDer just at Christmas. So just before I was identified, I suppose my oldest son at the moment is going about an ADHD assessment and so on as well. And he's identified as autistic and dyspraxic and all kinds of everything, if that makes sense. But nonetheless, I suppose I think about her specifically, and I kind of think that, it's so important that she is empowered with the knowledge and with the confidence to know that if I choose to share this, that it is absolutely great that I do, and that I shouldn't be met with judgment, that I shouldn't be met with unkindness, that I should be met with an absolute acceptance of who I am for my authentic self. And I suppose that's why, for me specifically, I feel it important that I do start to become loud and proud in relation to my neurodivergence of late, but equally I come from a space of absolute respect for the individuals who are very quietly confident and choose not to share that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I feel like it's my impulsive ADHD side that leads me to open my mouth before I think. And so in some ways, I feel like it's a benefit because I live loud and proud in a way that I feel like can be helpful. But I also feel like I'm not necessarily at the wheel with that. There's no intention behind that, right? So I'm curious. Oh, gosh, I have so many questions about how do you even know what is ADHD and what is the autism? Because that's a question I have all the time. And often I get even on this podcast, I get so confused where I'm like, what are we even talking about here? Because there's so much overlap. And I often I have these videos on Instagram of these quirks that I always thought were, just quirks of mine that I realize now have to do with ADHD. And oftentimes I will get the response, which, especially if I'm talking about sensory issues, lighting, sound, particularity around like what mug I use, and or things like any social or interpersonal issues. If I talk about those, the response I will often get is, "That's an autistic trait. That's not ADHD." And I'm like, how do you even know? There's so much overlap, and part of me doesn't want to get into that narrative of like, well, maybe I do have autism. Like, part of me feels like that's really kind of casual and in some ways disrespectful. I haven't had an autism diagnosis. I have had an ADHD diagnosis, so I feel comfortable talking about the ADHD part. But there's always these areas where I feel like there's so much overlap, and then am I doing a disservice to the autism community by co-opting, is it ableist of me to talk about these traits only in the context of ADHD and not in a larger framework of autism and neurodivergency, and that's when I get to that point where I'm like, what are we even talking about? Because I sort of feel like I'm more comfortable talking about neurodivergency and the fact that we all kind of fall in this camp. And maybe some of us have been diagnosed with ADHD, maybe some of us have been diagnosed with autism, but I could be totally wrong. Like, do you feel like there's a clear delineation, having been diagnosed simultaneously with both, where you can really say, this is the autism, this is the ADHD?
For me, I suppose, in my personal experience, I think that kind of anxiety around having to engage from a social perspective, I would absolutely attribute that to autism. I kind of think that the minute that there is any social pressure or social expectation placed upon me, that is absolutely autism, in my opinion. I suppose in my experience rather. But I'm mindful that at the same time that I think current stats are between 72 and 74% of autistic people are identified with a co-occurring ADHD diagnosis. So it's very, very hard to unpick and to pull one or another. I suppose, like, when I think about stimming, for example, I stim as an autistic person, but I also stim as an ADHDer. I suppose that fits beautifully into both categories. So I suppose it's not possible to decide whether or not one is more ADHD-like or more autism-like, if that makes sense. I kind of think that it speaks to our experiences and that we can only speak to our own true experience. That isn't it much more beneficial that these conversations are happening, and that sometimes that the lines are a little bit blurred, because then it allows for people to figure out where each of their traits or each of their kind of their presentation pieces sit for them. If it's very clearly put in a box, then it's going to make it more difficult to identify adults who might be late diagnosed ADHD. If it's very clearly put into an ADHD box, it might be much less likely that a person might be identified as an autistic person, as a much older person. So I kind of think there's that balance piece, definitely. I suppose the other thing that I'm thinking about with regards to autism specifically, for me, whilst I'm very proficient at speaking about autism, and I suppose I'd be quite proficient at speaking about ADHD as well. For me, it's not possible for me to split myself down the middle. The reality is that all of my experience to date have been shaped by being an autistic person and being an ADHDer. Do you know?
Yeah, I do, but you haven't cleared anything up for me.
I'm sorry.
No, I know it's and that's the other thing, is sort of like I feel like obsessive about getting to the root of what we're even talking about sometimes, and to a point where I just feel like I'm frustrating myself for no reason, because oftentimes the answer will be like, well, does it really matter at the end of the day? And I'm like, I don't know why, but it does.
Doesn't that speak to that absolute wonderful ability to be able to hyper focus and go down that kind of monotropic road and be able to just focus to that level of intensity? And I suppose even in that unfortunately in itself can be both autistic and ADHD. I suppose hyper focus can be, but doesn't it speak to the absolute wonder of a neurodivergent mind at the same time, whether or not they're categorized as autistic or ADHD?
Right? I know, exactly. And I'm like, if there's ever evidence enough that you're in the right place, having the right conversations, it's that obsessive drive for the answer. But, when you were talking about stimming and kind of how stimming can be, how you sort of deeply relate to it as from an autistic point of view, but also from an ADHD point of view, I also think about the term masking, right? Because that's another one, that masking was really a term that was used primarily in the autism community, and there has been some controversy about whether it's been co-opted by ADHDers as, in an ableist way. But I think, it's sort of like you were saying, the masking is one of those things where we really, so many of us relate to it so deeply because it comes back to that idea of not living as your authentic self and having to kind of fit yourself and feeling like a square peg in a round hole, and all of those ways in which we are kind of looking over our life through this new lens, realizing the degree to which we had to work to fit in, the degree to which we had to work to keep it together. And I feel like masking is one of those terms that so many of us relate so deeply to, and why is that co-opting, or is that just a deeper level of understanding in terms of how this conversation around neurodivergency is evolving?
I think the reality is that as neurodivergent individuals, we have all experienced the entire of our lives living on the periphery almost of societal norm. We have all experienced different situations where we haven't done the expected thing. We haven't spoken in the expected way. We haven't behaved in the way that other children or adults or whomever might behave. The reality is that when you are a person who experiences the world slightly differently to the majority of people in the world, it doesn't matter where you're positioned on the globe. The reality is that when you experience things differently like this, masking is one of the, I suppose, one of the most frequently utilized ways and means with which to protect ourselves from additional judgment and additional onslaught of kind of comments and negative comments and kind of that real kind of negative experience. Now, I suppose I don't absolutely, as well, I wouldn't ever advocate that people should have to mask. But I suppose I'm mindful that in my experience, again, that I have absolutely masked to the high heavens, as we say here in Cork, because of knowing that I didn't quite fit the norm, in inverted commas, but that knowing that I also didn't want to be the victim of that awful judgment and that awful critique that I have been that I have experienced, I suppose, on more than one occasion.
Yeah, I'm sort of going through this with my daughter right now, who's in high school. And she, when I first started out on this journey and was first diagnosed with ADHD, I looked at my son, who's in 5th grade, and I thought, yes, textbook, absolutely. He has it as well. I didn't come to my diagnosis through my children, as most adult women do. So I've been looking at them and seeing so many neurodivergent traits in both of them, but also, learning on my own and trying to, figure out what is the right path. And they both do very well in school. It is really important for them to do well. They're very competitive with themselves. They have very high expectations of themselves. And so they don't kind of present in a very typical ADHD way, which is why I have always been really reluctant to just go through their school district or just go to the pediatrician, because I feel very protective of this diagnosis journey for them, right? I don't want to fuck it up is basically my anxiety around it. And so with my daughter, but I see her now in high school really struggling with a lot of executive function issues, but at the same time still holding it together, still doing very well at school. And a lot of it is internalized, a lot of it is at home, and that only she is experiencing, that only I am seeing and her father is seeing. So we're going through this diagnosis process right now, and they want to reach out to her teachers. And I panicked because I realized her teachers are not going to see any of these signs. They're going to have no idea why we're doing this. They're just they're going to be totally in the dark. And it really kind of hit home how hard my children are working to present as this certain type of do good, perfect gold star child, and seeing how that's the anxiety and how negatively that's affecting their mental health as a result. And so to me, that's a clear sign of neurodivergency. But I'm also realizing that, like, to the teachers, they're going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything's great. Everything's fine. And how that narrative is so prevalent with children, right? That idea that, like, I don't know, they're doing fine. I don't see what the issue is. That there's, that there's a sense that, like, there's still this sense that asking for help or asking for accommodations is not allowed unless you are really, really struggling or really incapable of conforming, or all of those things that get children with the sort of stereotypical traits diagnosed. But this large swath of kids who are being overlooked.
I suppose, doesn't it speak to the level of lack of education there is amongst within the education system that our children have to navigate every day? Doesn't it absolutely speak to the fact that so many educators, so many teachers, be they in like primary or secondary school, it doesn't matter, doesn't it speak to how much they've got to learn? Like, my experience would have been similar here, insofar as I've got young people who absolutely they go into school every day. I have been the person or the parent who has questioned, why did you go about a diagnosis for your child? Like, I mean, why would you label him as autistic? That child isn't autistic. And me looking, saying, excuse me. It just, I suppose, it beggars belief that these people are involved in any diagnostic process that we undertake for our children, when they don't hold the level of education that they need to ensure that these kiddos who are masking and who are flying under the radar actually have their needs met. And I suppose the reality is that there needs to be that absolute shift from only looking after and meeting the needs of a kiddo who is hugely struggling from an outward perspective to actually ensuring that there's that kind of equitable accommodation for our kids who internalise everything as well. Because every child deserves every opportunity to become their best selves and to realise their potential. And educators need to get off of their arses and actually start upskilling and educating themselves so that they're meeting the needs of these kids. And I say that as an adult educator. So I suppose I get it, if that makes sense from an education standpoint as well. But they have to. They have to, because otherwise, I mean, the mental health crisis isn't coming from nowhere. The mental health experiences of our children aren't happening for no reason. In order to support our kiddos to be mentally well adults who aren't going to experience different suicidalities and real negative, I suppose, institutionalizations and hospitalizations and so on. They really have to start getting in there now and meeting their needs so that these kids don't fall off a cliff, so that they don't hit 18 and fall off of a cliff because they don't know where to go or what to do next.
Oh man, it's so heavy. Because it's true.
My apologies. I suppose I'm sorry, but I suppose it's so important. It is so important. It's so frustrating. It makes me so cross to think. I mean, I see these adults, I see women being identified, being diagnosed with depression and bipolar and all these kind of things all of the time. And when in fact they're either undiagnosed autistic women or undiagnosed ADHDers. I mean, get off your arses and sort it out so that these women aren't reaching that point of crisis. Let's make sure that our kids are positioned properly now so that we're not dealing with both a teen and an adult epidemic of mental health crises.
Yeah. And I think that's a question I bring up a lot on the podcast too, which is, does it feel like we are going through a mental health revolution right now, either as a result of I think it was kickstarted by the pandemic. Certainly it was started by lockdown and the changes in so many of our structures and also just sort of this increased awareness that's happening on social media and people being able to communicate and share their stories, but I'm always questioning, like, is this is this proliferation of diagnoses the result of this new awareness and the shifting conversation around what to look for and what even is considered neurodivergency, and or are we misreading it and it's totally something else, like a collective communal trauma that we're all going through that is temporary? Because you know what I mean? Like, and then again, I get back to that idea where I'm like, well, I think this obsessive questioning over what it is and what it isn't, is the neurodivergent experience. I don't remember what my question was. I think it was this idea that, like, we are obviously, there's so many more of us that that are out there. And are we changing the conversation to include all of these women who have lived their whole life undiagnosed? Or are we changing the conversation to the point where we no longer really know what even is ADHD? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like, is it harmful to sort of expand the idea of what ADHD and autism is to a point where people are kind of being lighthearted about it, being like, oh yeah, because we talk about that a lot with this idea that, like, oh, everybody's a little ADHD, everybody has that a little, and is that feels like, a disservice. It feels really belittling to people who have really been struggling. But then again, I don't know. I think I knew this was going to happen. I was so excited to talk to you, and I'm getting so, like, I have a million thoughts coming at me at the same time, and I'm having a really hard time sorting. So I apologize. But I guess my question is really about the expansion of what is autistic, right? So I feel like, we had a very frank stereotype of kind of what an autistic child looked like, how they acted. They were, who was easy to kind of spot. And now it feels like we're expanding this definition. We're expanding the idea of what autism looks like in children and in adults. And is there any part of you that feels like this could be not dangerous, but almost like we can start blurring the lines, so to speak? Or is it really, at the end of the day, is it really just about living, learning how to advocate and learning how to, not try to always just, fit and conform?
I suppose when you think about it, when you think about we'd say autism, for example, and the fact that it's centered around social communication and social interaction and those kind of in official terms, restricted interests and repetitive patterns of behaviour and so on. When you think about it like that, the reality is that individuals are going to struggle whether they have the label or not. Individuals who have difficulty with social communication and social interaction are going to struggle regardless. For now, unfortunately, because there's not that shift, that societal shift and societal awareness, and I suppose absolute acceptance of individuals for just who they are, because that isn't happening, it is absolutely necessary as of yet to label individuals. And I suppose for me, I always kind of think about having a label being empowering, because it allows for us to have a greater level of understanding and awareness and knowledge around ourselves, if that makes sense. I suppose separately though, when I think about autism from a diagnostic standpoint, we'd say when I was a little person, the DSM, so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, was in its third edition at that time. And for me to be identified as autistic as a little person of 2 or 3, it would have been necessary for me to be completely non-speaking and to have had a full regression in speech and so on, be completely non-speaking, and to be unable to engage with those around me, so to speak. In 94, they introduced the DSM-4, it was the Asperger's was brought in and so on and so forth. And then in 2013, it was shifted again, the DSM-5, and it became just autism levels 1, 2 and 3. The reality is that whether or not we've got the labels, these individuals are going to have difficulty in those moments. But also, I suppose the reality is that by expanding it, you are creating opportunity for more people to actually recognise who they are and to gain that level of knowledge and understanding of themselves. And by gaining that level of knowledge and understanding, we are positioning individuals then to be set up for success and to realise their potential and to become their best selves and so on. So I suppose whilst I get the question around that kind of blurring of lines and so on, the reality is that I've got some really good friends who without doubt I would look at and I would say definitely not autistic, absolutely nowhere are they autistic. Do you know what I mean? So there's that real strong group of non-autistic individuals. It's really important that individuals like who are autistic are equipped with that information, so that they are set up for success as well. I don't think that there's a problem with blurring of lines. The reality is I think the current global statistic is about 1.5% of the global population are being identified as autistic. So I suppose it's important that those individuals have that information about themselves.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah, that's a good reminder too, because I think sometimes I forget. I surround myself with women with ADHD all day long, and so sometimes I forget what it's like to, that it is such a small percentage still in this world, because I sort of feel like I look around and I'm like, is anyone not neurodivergent around me?
Yeah, we have a saying in our house, it's it's guma. So guma is the Irish is very good. If that's the Irish for very good, but oftentimes what I'll say is like we say tick box, so we're going tick box. And in school, if you get something right, as a young person, the teacher will say guma. We'll write down, we'll give loads of red ticks and we'll say guma. So the joke in our house is always now guma, as we see these neurodivergent individuals and so on. It's always that kind of guma. I've phone conversations with the guma. Yes, absolutely. So I get it. I do. I absolutely get it. I think, doesn't it speak to the level of community, actually? Doesn't it speak to the level of community when you say that you have so many people around you who are females identified with ADHD? Doesn't it speak to that absolute wonderful connection piece and the opportunity to have that wonderful holistic and positive community around you? Do you know?
Oh my goodness. Yes. And how important it is to find, how we do find each other and how important it is for us to have that community. And I often will say, I think finding your people is part of the treatment plan, because it's like we speak a different language. And I say, I feel like I'm at home in a way that I forget I don't feel like with many, many people. And, I say talking to other women with ADHD is like unbuttoning a too tight pair of jeans, because it really is just sort of like we just cut right to the chase and you get right in there, and we have these healing connections that are I think is so important to us, because so much of this adult diagnosis is shifting that narrative and thinking and changing our point of view of ourself and who we are in this world. So absolutely, it's so much of my own healing and treatment has been just conversation and meeting other women like you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now so I'm curious, because you obviously did not have these glaring presentations when you were a child, what are some of the things looking back now over the course of, looking back at your life where you say the signs were there all along? As a parent of a daughter, what should somebody be looking for?
So I suppose she's so different to me, first of all. She is this real witty, real funny, real great, vivacious character. This gorgeous, really gorgeous, gentle, kind energy. But I know that she's very quick. She's very quick. She's very quick in any kind of response, that kind of real kind of witty kind of response. I wouldn't be very quick off the mark. That's the first thing to say. So I suppose both of us would be so different, but yet we absolutely gel so well. And I think that if you've got a little person who is a neurodivergent individual, oftentimes we'd say my relationship with my with my daughter particularly is so much stronger, I think, because we are so similar in some ways, then at the same time that there is that connection piece, that there is that communication without judgment, and there is that kind of attuning to each other without judgment and kind of just getting what we mean and so on. So I suppose just to and that's my brain now going off in a million different directions, my apologies. But I suppose that's an important point to make, I suppose, is that sometimes we identify ourselves in our kiddos. That's like that's absolutely the piece. I suppose for me, when she was identified back in December, the clinician at the time, so I'm not sure about stateside, but here individuals are identified through either multidisciplinary teams, so psychology and OT and so on, or individuals can be identified by psychiatrists. And it was a psychiatrist who identified my young lady. And at that time, my understanding, on a very serious note before that, was that male, that little boy, that kind of cis male presentation where kiddos are bouncing off the walls and they're jumping around the place and they're the fellas who are running out into the middle of the road and all that kind of a crack. The reality is my daughter never presented like that. Never presented like that. And it was only when she was asked the right questions by her psychiatrist that it came to light that her brain never stops. Never stops. Her brain goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And I remember sitting there in the meeting going, her brain never stops, and that's not normal. That's not normal. Do you know, kind of going, jeepers, because I have definitely, without doubt, I am the person who will start talking and will lose my trail, like will almost like stop in mid-sentence sometimes because my brain has gone off on a completely different tangent. I'm the person who will wake in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and as my eyes open, my mind starts going. There's no kind of, okay, actually, where am I? There's not even that. There's not that kind of transition from one point to the next, if that makes, it's just going all of the time. And this was always the way. As a little person, I was the kid who always talked at length. Always. It was like teachers at parent-teacher meetings used to say to my mother, can you just tell her to stop talking, please? She has to stop talking. She has to give other people the opportunity to answer questions and so on. And I can remember being a pain in their arse with the teacher trying to answer questions and so on. I suppose in relation to that, you mentioned a while ago that you tend to say things like without thinking. I am the impulsive thinker. I am absolutely the impulsive thinker and the impulsive talker, where I say things like, oh God, why did I say that? Why did I say that? Sugar, reverse. And then I try and repair what I've said midway through a conversation. And it can become a disaster, an absolute disaster. I suppose, and that has always been my experience, absolutely. And I suppose to come back to your question earlier on, that's definitely for me, because it wasn't centred on those kind of real areas of interest. That for me is definitely ADHD and not autism. Absolutely,
right. Okay.
Definitely for me.
That was my next question.
I suppose the other thing that I'm thinking, I can remember being the person who oftentimes would try and figure out, okay, so like we'd say when I'm engaging with somebody, having to process what's going on or what's being said or whatever the case may be, and having to nearly figure out my next step before they'd say, before they'd finish what they were saying, I had my next step planned out and I was kind of coming at them immediately, if that makes sense. I suppose for me as well, I suppose when I was little, I stimmed hugely. And unfortunately, stimming, like in our house, I encourage kiddos to stim all of the time. But unfortunately, many moons ago, stimming was even less acknowledged as functional. It wasn't acknowledged at all, let's be honest. But I stimmed all of the time. I used to rock and I used to do all kinds of everything. You see my hands are moving on screen non-stop. And I suppose this is a processing piece. This is how I kind of focus my thoughts almost. This is something that I have always, even from the littlest age, I have always done this. I suppose I can remember too, with regards to school and studying and so on, like I did fine. Like in Ireland here, we do an exam called the Leaving Certificate. So it's that kind of, the exam that you might do at about 18 years of age. And I remember to have to study and prep for an exam. I found it absolutely impossible, not being able to focus, not being able to take information and trying to figure out, as you mentioned earlier on, that kind of, we'd say sorry, now I've lost my trail of thought. I suppose, no, actually, as you mentioned a while ago with regards to that kind of organising our thoughts, organising what we need to do next and so on, that can be so, like that for me was so difficult. Figuring out the kind of a learner that I was. Am I, I'm definitely not a learner who can sit and just look at something and take note. I'm definitely a kinesthetic learner. I'm definitely an auditory and a visual. That kind of multimodal learner is the way I'm going to put it. But the reality is that because I didn't have that information about myself when I was littler, I wasn't able to study. I wasn't able to prep. I wasn't able to kind of take large pieces of information in and focus on what I needed to focus on. I suppose when I think about hyper focus, I definitely was the person when I was little who became very, very focused on a particular topic and had to figure everything out about it, couldn't give up if I was talking about something, couldn't give up about what I was talking about until I had said everything I needed to say about it. And I know that can be sometimes attributed to autism, but for me it was both, because there was that kind of real, now retrospectively I suppose I know that there was that real intense brain piece involved in that as well, that real kind of intense cognition around that as well. I suppose the other thing that I'm absolutely mindful of is that kind of inertia that I would have also experienced, where I would have found it difficult to get to organise focus, to engage with the task at hand. So depending upon whether I was interested or not, for some tasks I could still be there and it still wouldn't be completed. So I suppose it's that kind of, we'd say that kind of combined type, ADHD combined type. It's that real intense focus, and then at the same time that real difficulty with planning out different stages, or planning out how to complete a task or whatever. I was always the person who, I got one instruction and I'd fly with the one instruction, and I was gone as people were sounding the second or the third instruction at me, so much so that I'd have to come back and I couldn't retain it all at once. So many different things, I suppose, so many different things. But there's one thing that comes to mind as a young adult. And I know that it was I was pregnant with my second son, and my gynecologist, my OBGYN at that time, said to me, "You're going to have to slow down." And I remember saying to my sister-in-law very indignantly, "They want me to slow down, and sure, aren't I grand? I'm so slow now. I could nearly be at a standstill, and sure, look, the belly is out here." And I remember her saying, "Do you not recognise that your slowing down is actually my normal?" I can and she's not identified as a neurodivergent individual. So there was absolutely that kind of, I was kind of going, all right, okay. And kind of going, Jesus, that's because she doesn't have the same energy as me. But now retrospectively, actually, that's one of the key things that has come back to me again and again and again as a person who was more recently identified as an ADHDer.
Yeah, interesting. Those moments where you're like, wait a minute, not everybody is like this. Okay, all right.
Yeah,
good
absolutely.
Information to know. Yeah,
absolutely.
So I'm curious. I'd love to ask if you could rename ADHD to something a little less confusing in terms of its acronym. Would you call it something else?
Absolutely. First of all, remove the bloody word disorder and remove the bloody word deficit in the name of God Almighty. Just remove it. That's it. Just take it. Just get rid of it. Stop pathologizing and medicalizing this condition is my genuine opinion. I kind of think that if we were to focus on individual strengths and utilize areas of strength to support any challenge that they might have, I kind of think that we'd be on a much better footing. I think that it needs to be shifted, to be moved from that kind of real medicalized, pathologized idea to one of unique individual perspective. I suppose, and I was kind of playing with this, and I'm not like, I'd like to think that I'm creative, and I can be very creative insofar as I can get things done very, very quickly, and I can kind of, once I start a logical pattern, a kind of a logical thought pattern, I can become very creative in my thinking. But creativity from let's think about this out of my imagination piece, because I'm autistic as well, that can be a bit challenging, is the way I'm going to put it. But I've been thinking about this, and I was thinking that actually something like the AAA might work better. The triple A standing for alternative augmented attention. So that kind of a profile piece. I suppose alternative because it's alternative to the 98 point whatever percent of the population who don't have that wonderful unique perspective. And then augmented, I suppose, as it allows, I suppose it enables and it allows for a person or a learner, I suppose, to creatively think and learn and to bring their unique perspective to the table. So I kind of think AAA, I think that might work.
I love it. It might not, it would be confusing in the US because we have the American Automobile Association. And so,
okay.
But it's funny because I always talk about how I often wish I had a AAA card for my diagnosis because I spend so much time doubting, did I get this wrong? Did I trick my doctor? All of those ways in which I am always questioning the diagnosis itself, that I often wish I had like a wallet size card that reminds me that yes, I have been diagnosed officially and all of that. So, but I do agree in terms of the, how it's labeled by its deficits. It's labeled according to the sort of, negative needing to manage traits, which is so frustrating because I think so much of it is really about finding the environment that is, and the environment and the strategies and the schedules that work for you and your brain and living your best life as a result.
There's 2 points, I suppose. One is that we speak about the mental health of young people. We've mentioned about it. We've spoken about it already. The reality is that when you tell a child that they are disordered in any way, you're going to compound the mental lack of mental well-being piece for that young person. So I suppose if for no other reason, that's a good enough reason to just lift it out, just remove it and rephrase it,
Yeah. Yeah, because I had this conversation very early on with my husband when I was first diagnosed, which he was very worried, because I was like, okay, if I'm diagnosed, look at our kids. And so we started looking at them, and he was very nervous about the label of ADHD and that diagnosis. And I was explaining like, well, they're going to get labeled either way. So either they're going to get labeled as being, depressed or lazy or all the things I was labeled with. This kind of label can be more freeing. It can really open a window into kind of, how to advocate for themselves. But at the same time, you're right. Like there is something really terrifying about labeling your child with a disorder when really the more you understand, the more it's not, the disorder is only in relation to the inability to conform in a certain environment that is asking too much of you.
Yeah,
like school
absolutely.
Classrooms and all of these ridiculous environments that we're putting kids into where
Absolutely.
they're, unable to conform, I guess.
Absolutely.
I was trying to think of a different word, but that's the best word.
The other thing I would say is that in relation to that environmental piece, there's a great guy here in the UK. His name is Dr. Luke Beard, and he's one of the senior autism professors, or lecturers rather, in Sheffield Hallam University. And he speaks very clearly, like his golden equation, self-professed as he always says, is autism plus environment equals outcome. And the reality is that anything plus environment equals outcome. So a positively situated environment will always, always, always equal a positive outcome for a child. In the same way that a negative environment will always result in a negative outcome for a child. So I suppose let's swap the autism with ADHD. ADHD plus environment equals outcome. I kind of think that it's a really good way of explaining how important it is that these environments are structured and created to best suit the needs of our kids. And there's another guy as well who is Dr. Damien Milton. He works I think he's in Kent University, and he speaks about the double empathy problem. And again, I think in the same way that it applies to autism, because he speaks about it in the context of autism, it can be applied to ADHD. And I suppose essentially he speaks to communication difficulties arising when autistic individuals are expected to engage with non-autistic individuals because there's that difference in neurotype. The reality is that when we think about autistic individuals and other autistic individuals, communicating and interacting with each other, there's not that same level of difficulty. The same again can be said for ADHDers, because the reality is that when you see and meet, and you mentioned it earlier on around that kind of finding your tribe and surrounding yourself with like-minded people and so on, it speaks to that kind of neurotype and same neurotype engaging so wonderfully together and creating these wonderful positive experiences. Do you know?
Oh yeah, yeah. And so I also talk about the importance of, I get asked, is it important for me to get diagnosed as an adult? Is it really, I've made it this far. Do I really need a diagnosis? And I'm always sort of, my answer is always yes and no, because on the one hand, I think a self-diagnosis and the ability to research and learn more about yourself is the most important part. I think we are in a situation right now where a formal diagnosis of ADHD can take years in some countries. And then even if you do get seen, you have no guarantee that you're going to see a medical professional who knows anything about what you are relating to and the questions you are having. And the fear of being minimized and rejected is so great that, I feel like you shouldn't wait for a formal diagnosis before you really start to begin to understand yourself and begin the treatment plan. And so much of that treatment plan is internal, right? And so I'm curious, if for somebody who has either been diagnosed with ADHD already or is still just kind of early on in the journey of exploring her neurodivergency, relating to ADHD traits, also relating to autism traits, do you feel like it's important to seek out the autism diagnosis? I guess for an adult woman who's questioning, I'm asking for a friend, what does she do next? I guess, does that importance of a diagnosis extend beyond, just having one diagnosis of either autism or ADHD? How important do you feel like it is to really kind of understand everything that's at play here?
I kind of think that, first of all, from a self-diagnosis standpoint, that it's absolutely essential that people who identify as autistic or ADHDers or whomever, any individual, neurodivergent individual who is self-identifying, isn't doing so because they're seeking out a label that doesn't make sense to them. That's the first thing I'm going to say. So I think it's really important that anybody who identifies themselves their identification is equally valid to that kind of professional diagnosis. So I kind of think, but for me specifically, I felt that it was necessary to go about a professional diagnosis, because I know you've mentioned that we can kind of research and find things out and so on and so forth. But I have no doubt, because of oftentimes those kind of obsessive kind of thought patterns and so on that I'd have, I would have no doubt that I would continue to say, well, yeah, maybe I do, maybe I don't, did I, as you said a while ago, did I kind of trick my clinician? I still have those kind of thoughts as well, if that makes sense. So the reality is that if I didn't go about a professional diagnosis, I would not it would not settle completely for me. I needed personally the validation of a professional to let me know that I wasn't going mad and that this was absolutely my experience. I suppose if my advice would always be for anybody who has that kind of a thought process where it's kind of that up and down, but they know that they're always going to be the person who's going up and down, and that it's not potentially not ever going to sit one way or the other, that then I do think that it is worth looking to a professional to validate what is going on. What I do think is essential to that, though, is sourcing a clinician or a professional who actually has a background in neurodivergent conditions, who actually has a genuine understanding of neurodivergent conditions in all of their glory, not just in those very stereotypical presentations, but also in those kind of more nuanced presentations. I think wherever possible, for me at least, I suppose, because of my experience, I think that it's worth saying that if you had the opportunity to access an assessment with a neurodivergent clinician or professional, all the better, because there's just that additional layer of empathy, understanding and kindness that you're going to be met with.
Yeah, that was really moving. When I was listening to your interview that you did with your son on your own podcast, as your sort of coming out interview when you were
Yeah.
diagnosed, loved what you said about your advice to clinicians, which is when somebody is seeking a diagnosis, they're not coming to this casually. They are relating deeply. They are seeing patterns throughout their whole life. Nobody just sort of thinks they want to fake it,
No, no.
and so to have that empathy and to have that, the kid gloves when dealing with anybody who is coming to you, and just how damaging it is to understand how damaging it can be for somebody seeking a diagnosis to be told by a clinician, oh, you're fine. Don't
Yeah.
worry about it. I don't see anything wrong with you. Or, what's the point? You've gotten this far. That's another one I hear all the time, which just drives me crazy. Somebody being told by their doctor, like, what's the point? You're managing fine. You've made it this far. What would a diagnosis help? How would a diagnosis help you?
It's bonkers. It's bonkers because when you think about it, many of us have experienced so many different levels of trauma right throughout the entire of our lives, right throughout, and trauma, not giant. Some people, unfortunately, yes, but it doesn't have to be giant trauma. Trauma from a kind of a rejection standpoint, trauma because of not feeling like you mattered or that you were good enough, and so on, and that kind of continuous negative internal conversation going on as a result. And the reality is that for somebody then to say, look, you're after getting this far, they not only disregard your question around yourself, but they're also disregarding and dismissing all of what it takes for you to continue to be able to navigate the world every day without this information. So I suppose my advice to anybody who's met with somebody like that is, swap doctors, find somebody
Trust
who
yourself.
is absolutely going to listen.
And don't stop. Trust yourself. Trust your experience. Absolutely. Which is difficult, obviously, for us.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, I think really listen to that voice, however tiny it is, deep within you. That you said, that voice isn't going to it's not going to go away. It's just going to niggle, and it's going to stay there, and it's there for a reason. Oh my God!
Absolutely.
I'm so glad you reached out to me, Sharon. I'm so glad I discovered your incredible podcast, Autism Journeys. Is it still a radio show, or is it a podcast? Or
it's podcast since the pandemic. Now it's moved on to just podcast for now, but it will, fingers crossed, move back into the realm of radio again. Please God, shortly. I suppose it's there's loads of information, and I suppose just to preface that as well with we'd say my position. So I'm always, we'd say, looking to the strengths of individuals. But what I will say is that when the podcast first started, when the show first started, I interviewed different individuals and so on. And I suppose I know that some people get a little bit cross, but I actually choose to leave out some of the earlier podcasts up there because we'd say, let me think now. I'm trying to process my thoughts now. I suppose when I first started, there was more pathologized language used. It was autism spectrum disorder and so on. And I suppose as I started figuring things out, obviously there was that transition. But initially, at least, there was the more pathologized language. And I suppose one of the reasons that I leave all of this, all podcasts up there regardless, is because it shows, if nothing else, the journey that we have taken in the last 5 years, and where we were 5 years ago to where we are now is hugely different. It is so important to recognize that journey, and to recognize that if we want to support people in as they navigate their autism journey, that they have to see, it's important that they're aware of where we were, so that we don't go back there, and so that we continue to move forward. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, I know, right? Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm thinking of the first episodes that I published of this podcast.
Yeah.
I was in such a different place, and people ask me, where should I start with the podcast? And I always say, if you're just getting diagnosed, start at the beginning, because that's where I was.
Yeah.
I was at the beginning of my diagnosis journey too. So I was asking probably a lot of the same questions you're asking now. And but yeah, it's such a wealth of information. The conversations and the interviews are top notch. They're fantastic. And I really applaud you and the work that that you are doing and this incredible journey you've been on. But in addition to the radio show, you also do public speaking. And how can people find you? What's your website, and how can people find you, and can they work with you?
So my website is autism-journeys.ie. So whatever the www.autism-journeys.ie. I'm on Facebook, Autism Journeys Radio Show and Podcasts, and I'm on Instagram as well. I think is it autism.journeys on Instagram. I am on Twitter, but I'm very inactive on Twitter. I tend not to, I find it difficult to hold too many balls in the air. But I suppose, isn't it? I think I've met a like-minded and kindred spirit today, definitely, without doubt. I think, I suppose if people want to contact me, they can, I know on the website specifically, there's email, there's phone numbers, there's social media, there's everything, LinkedIn, everything is on the website. So that's probably the easiest place to touch base if anybody wanted to find out more, or actually if somebody wanted to even find out more about the podcasts and so on, all of that information is there.
Yeah. Oh, so wonderful. Well, thank you again, Sharon. It's been a real pleasure getting to talk to you and pick your brain and hear more about your story. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've absolutely loved having a chat with you today.